As the 2 weeks of talks draw to a close at COP27 at Sharm El Sheikh in Egypt today, representatives of almost 200 countries are pressed to reach an agreement. Nations remain divided on issues such as loss and damage and the phasing out of fossil fuels. Against this backdrop, the UN has published the first draft of a final agreement between the parties at COP27. The draft includes some goals from last year, such as supporting the phase down of coal power. The text does not include details of a fund for loss and damage caused by climate impacts. CNBC Africa was at Sharm El Sheikh to cover the 2 weeks of talks and negotiations. For this highlight special, we caught up with some of the delegates.
With 10 of the most vulnerable nations to climate change in Africa, Africa desperately is in need of green transition. We're joined by Daniel Schroth from Africa Development Bank. He holds the director position of Renewable Energy. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, it's a pleasure being here, and it's a very important topic.
Absolutely. So how has your time been so far at COP27? Today is Decarbonization Day. How did it go for AFDB here, especially for your portfolio?
Well, it's been a very hectic COP. We are hosting, together with the African Union and the UN Economic Commission for Africa, the Africa Pavilion. So we have a lot of events covering adaptation and mitigation. So specifically on renewable energy, we've had a fantastic event today on Desert to Power, our transformative program for the Sahel, the countries spanning from Senegal in the west all the way to Eritrea and Djibouti in the east. Those are countries that are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. They're amongst the most fragile countries in the world, yet they have some of the best solar potential worldwide. And if you look currently, how much solar generation capacity is existing in these 11 countries, it's only 730 megawatts according to IRENA statistics, which is just 0.086% of total solar generation capacity. So that's nothing, and that's really what the Desert to Power initiative tries to address by providing sort of catalytic risk mitigation instruments, bringing in the private sector and partners to advance renewable energy projects, particularly solar projects in these countries.
Glad you mentioned the solar power mega project that you're talking about. Tell us a little bit more in detail. Who is coming in with the funds? What is the nature of this finance? And what's the timeline here?
Yes, I mean, in terms of the financing, and we had today 2 big announcements at the event. The Kingdom of Norway has committed to provide 300 million Norwegian kroner, which is roughly $29-30 million in grant funding. GEP, which is, as you know, it's a partnership and alliance of different philanthropy organizations such as the Rockefeller Foundation, IKEA Foundation, and the Best of Earth Fund, and they've also committed and signed the instrument to provide 35 million into CEFA as well. So for us, it's been quite an important and successful day. Those are important amounts, not sufficient, but we have also been able, with the Green Climate Fund, to participate in our session to mobilize $150 million from the Green Climate Fund, and that will really help to de-risk private sector investments in utility-scale solar projects in the Sahel countries. We're providing partial risk guarantees, sort of to to reduce the risk linked to the public utilities who have to be the off-takers for these independent power producer projects, and also provide concessional resources for battery storage, which is critical in order also to increasing the share of solar in the networks of these countries.
Oh, do please tell a little bit more about the battery storage technology and the expansion and building capacity in that area. It's been said that private sector does not want to get involved in Africa, and why still climate finance is still lesser than other parts of the global south is precisely because there's so much lack of infrastructure, existing infrastructure. So you can set up giant plants, but how are you going to transmit all that energy?
I think that's a fantastic question, and I think I would simply say there's clearly no transition without transmission. That's put it very bluntly and simply, but it's true. If you don't have the transmission infrastructure, the interconnections, particularly for smaller kind of countries, to anchor sort of larger shares of variable renewables, whether it's from solar or wind, there are limits sort of what the networks can take. So a key priority for the African Development Bank is to invest in these interconnection projects, to invest in strengthening transmission capacity and also improving the flexibility of the transmission system. And battery storage is one key aspect of that. We had last year financed in South Africa a first sort of utility-scale battery storage project with Eskom, and we hope sort of to be able to replicate these type of projects also in other countries going forward. So that's really a very important aspect.
Where do you stand on the little materials that are required, very critical to battery creation of the battery? Where do you stand on the fact that a lot of those minerals are actually coming from Africa, getting made somewhere else, and then being sold back to Africa at a higher cost? Something that a lot of countries won't be able to afford despite your amazing efforts in this area.
No, and again, I think you're absolutely spot on, because as you rightly put, a country such as the Democratic Republic of Congo possesses a lot of the minerals needed for batteries, to produce batteries. Yet we don't want to see, let's say, DRC just being a supplier of the raw materials. We want really to help kind of convert this into a battery storage kind of industry that can then sort of supply that type of solutions across the African continent. That's a key focus now going forward from the African Development Bank side, from other partners as well. And it will really require sort of a collective effort. It's not something that any one institution will be able to do on its own. Similarly, at the moment, Africa is paying a premium. It's paying more for battery storage solutions. It's paying significantly more for solar panels. Yet all of that could be produced in Africa. So we really need to develop the infrastructure, the industrial kind of complex to develop these solutions on the ground.
How would that take place if it hasn't happened despite the last 20 years of effort? How? Because now we're really closing in on the window and Africa has barely contributed. In fact, could be almost under zero contribution in many ways in different types of mathematics there. But so what is Africa going to do about it to fast track this process, and what is AFDB going to do?
Well, again, obviously, if when we start sort of looking at what is the situation today, we see that there's very little has happened to date, and clearly, first of all, you need to have clear plans. You need to do all the feasibility work, sort of really understand what is required in terms of input, what is required in terms of all the manufacturing that is required, and obviously what is the financing cost of that, and then clearly, sort of the scale of financing required is of such magnitude that this will require a lot of risk mitigation instruments. It will require the DFIs to come in to help provide sort of the more concessional type resources, but obviously requires a lot of investment from the private sector.
Right, because this has been an issue. A lot of the climate finance that has come in has been DFIs, and private sector finance is truly what is needed, don't you think?
Well, I think if you look at the International Energy Agency, I think estimates that for energy transition in Africa to happen, you need roughly $100 billion on an annual basis. This is significantly several multiples of what sort of the current investment looks like in the energy sector in Africa. We know the debt sustainability issues of many African countries, of course, exacerbated by the multiple crises that we're experiencing, so it can only go with the private sector. And let's also be clear, the private sector, while we need to work on risk mitigation, the private sector also needs to be able to take risks. I mean, there are a lot of opportunities here. There is a big element of perceived risk when we talk about Africa, which is not actual risk, it's perceived risk. And we sort of also need to try to address that issue in terms of promoting the opportunities, highlighting that, yes, there are risks on which we are working, but they are by no means the way that a lot of people think outside of the continent. If you look at, I think my president recently put up a very interesting statistic from Moody's Analytics that looked actually at default rates of infrastructure projects worldwide. And what is really surprising is that the lowest rate of infrastructure default rate is actually in Africa, far lower than all the other continents in the world. So I mean, there's a striking difference between sort of the realities on the ground and sort of what is sort of the perception of many investors and others outside, particularly outside of the continent. And just to be clear, it's not just about bringing investments from outside, it's really about mobilizing local investment, supporting local entrepreneurs. It really needs to happen within the continent. It cannot just come from outside.
With Eskom in the headlines in South Africa on a daily basis, it was good to bump into Priscilla Jesi, a senior advisor on funding execution and a just energy transition project funding lead at Eskom Treasury. Priscilla is a PhD candidate in sustainable development.
Here at COP27, we're joined by Priscilla J.Z., the funding lead at Just Transition Finance at ESCOM. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Priscilla, now that ESCOM has been taking up some projects in transition and as the lead in that area, what are going to be some great challenges to be faced by African energy companies when looking to transition from their standing already non-green projects to green projects?
When it comes to the practicalities of implementation, there's catchment of issues. So climate finance alone cannot, fund or cater for the transition, the energy transition. So it needs to be blended with transition finance, because as you know that climate finance finances only green, and we are on a journey. So we need to blend it with transition finance that is funding the journey to green. So it encompasses the transition activities to green. So it is important that the institutions, also financial institutions, reform and become flexible in appropriate funding mechanisms for the transition, energy transition. So funding the transition needs a blended finance solution. So in terms of adding your climate finance, your transition finance, your grant funding, because you need to cater for the social part also. So we're saying it's a just transition because there's a justice part that needs to be reskilling employees, catering for the community, industrialization and all that. So that component is important. So the structuring is important because you are demolishing, you are decommissioning, you are repowering and repurposing, and then you are also catering for the social part of it. So that is very important.
Here at COP27 today, Decarbonization Day, what are you seeing with respect to this? What kind of cost-effective measures will be taken for companies, energy companies, when they look to transition? Because this is going to have a lot of outflow of cash from their own companies, and to fast-track this, there has to be incentives.
Yes, definitely. So when I'm talking about appropriate funding mechanism, I'm also talking about appropriate funding mechanism that are result-based. Sustainability-linked facilities that looks at the transition milestones. So if it looks at the transition milestones, it will incentivize for decarbonization. So you also need to be incentivized for decarbonization. So hence the financial institutions must also look at those mechanisms to incentivize for decarbonization.
How are development banks looking at this aspect of transition, especially in the energy sector, going from coal to green energy, whichever form? How are developing banks looking at it here at COP27? The decarbonization mechanisms, how much of that is being kept into account? That this transition is going to be very cost heavy and also, otherwise heavy to people who are going to lose jobs. There's going to be a transition, a good one. In some sense, it is just that you're going to be able to transfer these jobs, but there's still going to be losses to economies.
Yes.
So how are they looking at that?
So I think they're looking also at increasing the portion of adaptation. There's been a lot of focus on mitigation. So now if there can be the increase of the adaptation in terms of the funding, that will help a lot in terms of the communities, and also it will help in terms of the loss and damage. So I think it's important that as we're repowering and repurposing, mitigating, we must also look at adaptation.
Well, so far, adaptation finance has not been that great, like you said, a lot of focus on mitigation. What are you seeing here this year? I mean, it's still not up to the mark.
No, it's still not up to the mark, but there is that recognition that it needs to be increased.
But isn't this year about implementation? Recognition has been happening for the last 5 years.
Yes, definitely. Implementation, you can have strong commitments, you can have pledges, but without an implementation, they are nothing, but the emphasis this year definitely, you see its action, its implementation, the announcements from the Glasgow COP26, and now we're starting to see the investment plans. We're starting to see implementation, so definitely that is happening in this COP.
The Glasgow Pact was going to be unpacked this year in terms of implementations, windows, timelines. How has that been going?
No, it's going well, but like I'm saying that on the South Africa perspective, we have released the investment plan, so the clear roadmap for implementation. So we're happy with that. Yeah, as much as I'm wearing my cap of the PhD researcher on the transition finance and its role to transition finance, but as a negotiator also of the World Bank Committee, so I'm also sharing that aspect. But we are happy with the investment plan. I think the South African government have done very well in terms of outlining and the roadmap for the implementation, because the implementation is key more than the strong commitments.
At the moment, the plan, the implementation plan for just transition is looking quite neat. But at the same time, as a negotiator, when you enter one of these rooms representing Eskom, a company that has actually had some trouble in the recent past, how are you able to gain their trust?
With that one, it's funny because they are very supportive in terms of understanding that the challenges that we face as SOEs are unique, high debt and all that. They actually, when we're negotiating, we're negotiating highly concessional finance, so that we are able to bring down the cost of capital. So if we're negotiating with the development banks, we're taking the development finance and blend it to the very concessional climate finance to bring down the cost of capital, so that we don't add debt over debt, you understand. And also are now very flexible to partnership structures, PPP. So that is also helpful, so that we really don't add debt over debt, but innovative structures is the way to go.
Hailing from the DRC, Wildlife Works is the world's leading REDD+ program development and management company that brings innovative market-based solutions to the conservation of biodiversity. Over 20 years, Wildlife Works established a successful model that uses the emerging marketplace for REDD+ carbon offsets to protect threatened forests, wildlife and communities.
Now, Africa is losing its forests faster than anywhere else in the world, and the time is now to save them. We're joined by J.R. Bongoif, the head of DRC Wildlife Works, to tell us about how carbon credits can play a critical role in helping afforestation, reducing deforestation, and improving the lives of the communities that live around these forests. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Can you tell me about how many projects in DRC right now are carbon ready for investment?
Actually, there are only 2 projects and 5 more on the pipeline, and some other investors looking for projects in DRC.
Okay, now that you're here at COP27, what is the environment like here? When mechanisms for the carbon markets are being drawn up, are they keeping in mind the needs of the local areas, the regions which are so diverse in Africa? Are you impressed with it?
Actually, yes and no. I am very impressed with the private sector stepping up for carbon and for conservation. But again, if you look at the countries, it's still the same as every year in the COP. So it looks like for the public world, for countries, there is no urgency in protecting the forest or in saving the climate. But I said yes and no, because I see that the private sector is more conscious about our future, about the future of the climate, and they are kind of up to fighting the climate crisis.
Right, so you're hopeful about private sector investment in the forest and the carbon credits region of DRC. But tell me a little bit about you being here. How do you want to champion for better mechanisms so that DRC carbon projects are in compliance with what the global demand is?
Yeah, actually, the market is still really small, and there are a lot of needs to protecting the forest, especially in DRC. We have like nearly 150 million hectares of forest in DRC, and if we can protect even half of it, it will be very, very helpful for the climate. At this time, it is it's still at the infancy stage, but we need to do more.
Oh, absolutely. A lot more needs to be done. And DRC is so critical to the world, considering all the green cover that exists there and also communities that live there. Tell us a little bit about indigenous peoples and local communities and in what way can your carbon credits initiative help them?
I can tell you that the community are the one who are protecting the forest. We can say in our offices that we want to protect the forest, or the government say that they can protect the forest, but it is the community that actually protect the forest. And if we don't give them the alternative, then the forest will not be protected, because the first enemy of the forest protection is poverty. So poverty means slash and burn agriculture, and slash and burn agriculture means deforestation, and of course the forest will not be protected. So we need to help them have alternative, intensify their agriculture, and get more of what they need for their livelihood. This is what we are doing in the Maindombe area. With our project, we are building schools, because when you build schools, you have less deforestation agents in the future, right? When kids don't go to school, then they will become deforestation agents, and you'll have more deforestation agents in the village, so this will increase the deforestation. That's long term. But at the short term, what you need for community is to provide them what they need right now in order for them to stop slash and burn agriculture, or lower the rate of deforestation. So also this is what we are providing to our community in these villages. We work with them, with agronomists, to intensify agriculture in already degraded lands. And I guess this works, because actually, we have protected biodiversity. When we started in 2011 in the Maindombe area, we didn't see a single elephant. Now we have 100 elephants back in the forest. We have bonobos, which is the pygmy chimpanzees, the closest human. The closest animal closest to human. So we have bonobos in the forest, playing and enjoying.
Well, certainly, the return of wildlife, all these animals back to an area, is a brilliant sign of work being done correctly. But tell me a little about this. Considering the global carbon pricing, are you happy with it when it comes down to what can be received by these communities, by your organizations, actually to put this money forward in the right direction? Or would you like something to change, and then what do you want to change?
Okay, if I'm happy, the answer will be yes and no. At this time, we came long way. We came long way. We've sold carbon credit at $2 even, $2 a ton, and now we went to $15, and with $15 a ton, the community received a lot of money that can help them protect the forest. But I cannot say that, yes, I'm happy with that. But, yes, it's a good price, but we need more.
Oh, absolutely, I agree. So now today at COP27, it's Decarbonization Day. I can't let you go before we get a quote from that. A lot of the times this is being critiqued that richer nations are considering buying credits from poor nations to decarbonize, to get carbon credits into and reduce their emission levels. Not exactly, but in number terms, which also takes away that right from poorer nations that are actually doing the work and those credits belong to. What do you have to say that?
Well, this is a tough question for me. This is a tough question for me, but it's. I don't see things the way you were presented. I see things this way. We need always to work together. We have something that is already on a kind of economy which depends on carbon. And we cannot change, just in one day and move to a non-carbon economy. But what we need to do is walk one step by step, developed nations and us, to get to a level where we can protect our climate.
Well, I am in agreement with you as far as the current goals are concerned. You have to safeguard these regions and these people and these forests. But in the longer run, the question of correct carbon pricing will be more important. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Ahead of the scheduled close of COP27 today, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres called on governments to overcome their differences and deliver meaningful results. He said the parties at COP27 had a chance to make a difference here and now, and he urged them to act quickly.
Here, there, anywhere, no fossil fuels. Here, there, anywhere.